Hey everyone, this is Chris Davis, your video and feature producer here at 4Player. And finally, after way too long a wait, is my top 10 list of my favorite games of 2021. 2021 was a pretty contentious year for me and my gaming habits. Between a second entire year of a pandemic that should have been over and done with within a couple months of the vaccine rollout, to some personal business that cut my free time in half, which I hope to be able to talk to you about sometime this year. My schedule and ability to really try out a variety of games was in a less than ideal state. Instead of playing a lot of new stuff like I wanted, I found myself hitting my back catalog and doing my homework, as they say. Part of that homework was earning a definitive understanding of just what it is to be a Metroidvania, as I took the time to play through both Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the first time. And before we proceed, let me just make this clear. I enjoyed my time with both of them, despite some flaws that have not aged well in the nearly 20 to 30 years since their respective releases. After playing through both, I was efficiently Metroidvania'd out and had no intentions of playing another for a good long while. That was until Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth Record of Lodoss War came out. This long-winded title from developer Team Ladybug exited early access on Steam in July and received a formal console launch in December. With the holidays on hand, I played through the game and found myself really enjoying it. As you can tell from the footage, Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth is a gorgeous game, and though I think this is one of those games that should sell you just on its looks alone, there's a really good experience to be found here. Like its compatriots that it draws significant inspiration from, Wonder Labyrinth gives you a sizable yet more direct open map to explore that gates progression behind unlocking skills and weapons. I drew a lot of ire when I tried to describe it as having linear elements when I was talking about it on the podcast, so let me take a moment to say that this game is not meant to have the legs of a core Castlevania or Metroid experience. You're meant to finish this game in just about 7 hours or so. So you won't find a ton of secrets, and this game will pretty much direct you where you need to go to next. You won't be stumbling upon a lot of hidden optional bosses. You'll be considerably confused about the story until shortly before the end, and you're not going to be backtracking a whole lot. All of which goes against the typical elements of the formula, but that being said, I feel that the gameplay on tap here strongly makes up for it. Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth feels very much like Symphony of the Night combat-wise, with a good assortment of weapons with different stats and capacities, but I think my favorite part of the loop comes from your elemental powers. Seemingly inspired by the polarity mechanic at the heart of Ikaruga, Deedlit's adventure encourages you to frequently swap elemental alignments of wind and fire to charge up the opposite's power and deal extra damage when you swap to it. So, in other words, you'll deal damage with the wind power to charge up fire, and vice versa. Now once you're at full power, that weapon you're wielding deals extra damage, and if your opposite power is at level 3, then you'll be auto-healed over time for every bit of damage you take. The end result strongly encourages experimentation and taking risks rather than trying to be conservative. It's really quite fun, and makes for some challenging but cool boss fights. Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth was a game that I didn't set out to play in 2021, but I'm glad I did. Despite my complete lack of knowledge about the source material of Lodoss War, I never felt so disconnected from the story to really be turned off. Quite the opposite, actually. I found myself becoming quite interested to learn about these characters and where they come from. Wonder Labyrinth is a short, fun, Metroidvania-like experience that has a considerable amount more going for it beyond its visual design, and for those looking for a classical experience while waiting for Hollow Knight Silksong to arrive sometime in the next 3 to 5 years, Wonder Labyrinth makes for a nice, short treat. As I mentioned, 2021 was a pretty shit year, and no sector of our society was immune to damage from the COVID-19 pandemic. As such, there was a considerable amount of games I was excited for and wanted to dedicate time to that ended up being delayed or disappearing into obscurity. It was with this in mind that I approached the guys and said that this year's criteria for Game of the Year content can be relaxed a bit. Odds were going to be that we were going to be seeing continued delays well beyond the turn of the calendar year, so to actually have top 10s, expanding what could count as a valid entry made sense. Thus, it was with delight that the Mass Effect trilogy, after nearly a decade of demand, finally got the next generation collection port it rightfully deserved. And I would have been remiss if I did not re-embark on the nearly 100-hour journey that was Shepard's story. To be clear, those who have been following this for a long time know that I am a big Mass Effect fan, and even an Andromeda apologist. However, what you may not have realized is that I had experienced the entire trilogy using Mail Shep, much to the mockery and condemnation of my peers. So, eager to re-experience BioWare's arguably penultimate work, I embarked on the Fem Shep trilogy run. While I must say that I feel like Mark Meer's performance is just a tad better than Jennifer Hale's, I did enjoy what was on tap. In addition to this being the first time I've ever done a Fem Shep run, this also served as the first time I've played through the original Mass Effect game since 2007's launch, which, I had to say, represents a night and day improvement with the Legendary Edition over the source material. As groundbreaking as the original was 15 years ago, it had a lot of problems that never got patched or remotely addressed. So seeing all these bugs and issues that drove me up the wall all those years ago be non-existent in this glow-up made for perhaps the most delightful sigh of relief in respect to the apprehension I had knowing that I was committing myself to a triple-digit hour experience. There's really not that much I can say other than to repeat decades-old praises about BioWare's work. It's still a great trilogy of stories that should be remembered for the journey, not the ending. The only notable regret that I have with the Legendary Edition comes from the obvious lack of Mass Effect 3's stellar co-op multiplayer, which I put hundreds of hours into. Luckily, the servers are still up on PC, and I'm happy to report that there is a small but dedicated following for it, so any owners of the original game on Steam or Origin can dive in and enjoy it to the absurdity that is being a Volus Vanguard or a jet-propelled Turian. The Legendary Edition of the Mass Effect trilogy does not bring anything new to the table that you couldn't have experienced before. However, the past several years have seen a significant uptick in remasters, remakes, and reinterpretations of games of yesteryear that, for all intents and purposes, were likely to slowly disappear into memory. Publishers have discovered that modest re-releases serve as a nostalgia bait and gateways for younger, newer customers as a means to help fund development of other games. Not to mention market tests to see if there's a substantial enough appetite for an existing property to warrant further releases. Publishers are going to continue to drop these on our laps, which will become increasingly harder to ignore. Mass Effect Legendary Edition is a fine example of these remasters doing justice to the source material and being done right. Sometime this year, I will probably try to do an Insanity run of all three games to earn those platinum level trophies, and I will feel only a modicum of shame in doing so. You should know by now that I'm a story guy, someone who is willing to sacrifice gameplay in favor of some great writing and events that will stop me in my tracks. So it was that I've been aware of Road 96 for a good while, and while pitched in a way that provides stark reminders of the stomach-turning political turmoil that was the 2020 presidential election season, you could tell from the marketing that this game was being written with a level of optimism and hope that my already addled mind needed to experience. And, as pitched, the game was just that. A commentary about hope in a time of political change that had a level of anticipation and dread to it that builds towards a rather satisfying climax if you had the prudence to try to do your part to leave your influence in the characters and world that you travel through on the road towards the Petrian border. For the uninitiated, Road 96 is a first-person roguelike conversation experience game, in the vein of the formula Telltale established 2 generations ago. You play as a series of randomly generated teenagers of varying backgrounds and motivations, hitchhiking across the country of Petria, trying to escape the country in the months leading up to a big election in which the fascist dictator of the country is facing a competent political opponent. In each run as a teen, you experience a number of vignettes in which you encounter a series of characters that all have an interconnected story that you discover as the game progresses. From a reluctant cop who sympathizes with runaways, to a pair of bumbling highwaymen trying to make a name for themselves, To the likes of a trucker with a big secret and even a television newscast celebrity who shills propaganda for the government, you are always experiencing something new, varied, and always interesting as you make your way closer and closer to the border crossing. It's a relatively cool experience, but what pushes Road 96 onto my Game of the Year list this year was a recurring character named Jared. Now, I really don't want to go into details about him and what happens as the story progresses, but suffice to say, Jared is perhaps one of my favorite characters of 2021. Jared the taxi driver has no chill. And while I will not take away the thrill of meeting him and experiencing his story, I will say that each scene with him demonstrates that developer Digix Art has the chops to make a really good horror game if given the chance. He's the primary reason why I tried very hard to get Nick to play this game, and I sincerely hope that he, as well as anyone who is watching this right now, gives Road 96 a chance. It's a competent, interesting story with heart, great writing, and strong thriller aspects that will keep you coming back run after run.
Feel free to join if you can hang.
Arcane over the past decade has become one of my absolute favorite developers. Between the original Dishonored back in 2012, its expanding universe that continued in 2016 and 2017, followed by the Prey franchise reboot, I've fallen in love with their open-ended map design, systems-driven gameplay models, and incredible lore building. That love extends to their latest creation, Deathloop, though not as strongly as I anticipated. Deathloop didn't need 15 trailers over 2 years to convince me that I needed it day one, and it still moderately confuses me just how people didn't really understand what the game was going to be after the first gameplay demonstration. You need to kill 7 targets in the span of a single day, try to survive an 8th that is actively hunting you, and if you don't make it or you run out of time, you simply restart the loop. What's not to understand there? Now, I do love me some Deathloop. The 60s era retro-futuristic level and character design strongly makes it stand out from the crowd visually, and the optional asymmetric multiplayer component makes every loop a thrill to experience. Heck, for Arcane lovers like myself, the narrative connections to Dishonored alone is enough to have me frothing at the mouth for more. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't specifically mention the game's greatest flaw: the loop structure itself. Instead of going for a more daring and enticing idea of letting players figure out an optimal run for taking out all the targets, the game leads you by the hand towards the story-correct, singular route option to defeat the Visionaries and end the loop once and for all. In that regard, while the execution of this final run is indeed exciting, it doesn't feel like it lives up to the dynamic opportunities provided to the player in either Dishonored or Prey Mooncrash. But with that being said, Deathloop offers a great experience from start to finish. Though I would advise perhaps turning off the online Juliana invasion mechanic at this point, I still think it's a great example of such a mechanic working in something that wasn't developed by From Software. Speaking of, playing as Juliana, when you can actually matchmaking and find a Cole player to invade, the experience is just as tense and exciting as when you're Cole. I really do like Deathloop. I just wish that Arcane hadn't lost faith in their customers and allowed a more open-ended structure like what was pitched in that gigantic marketing campaign. But still, it was a great enough game to make it to my number 7 spot. I really wish I understood which Square Enix executive it was that Eidos Montreal angered enough to be cursed to being screwed over again and again and again ever since the release of Deus Ex Human Revolution in 2011. Some way or another, with every game they developed since then, Eidos Montreal's games have been subject to destructive marketing campaigns being assigned to projects that they shouldn't have been working on in the first place, and having sales expectations placed on them that even a Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts game would be considerably pressed to meet. So it was that we saw the Deus Ex Expanded Universe put on indefinite hold, the lackluster conclusion to the modern Tomb Raider trilogy, and now the rather good but decidedly poor-selling Guardians of the Galaxy adaptation. You would think that Square Enix would have done more to market the game and distance itself from the disaster that was their Avengers title, but nope. That dark deity disguised as a Square Enix executive has struck once again. Guardians of the Galaxy is perhaps the best Marvel game adaptation made since Disney launched the MCU. The writing is great across the board. The acting and performances of the cast are strong enough to make for a competent competitor for the transmedia envisioning of the franchise when put to comparisons with James Gunn's films, and is varied enough in its storytelling focuses and decision-making opportunities to show that the DNA responsible for the revival of the Deus Ex franchise is still there. Though the combat is perhaps the lowest on the totem pole in terms of quality in comparison to the rest of the game, it's serviceable enough to get the job done. But again, it's the writing and the personal scenes and conversations between the heroes that really makes the game stand apart. There are moments throughout the game that will make you take pause, surprising you for what they're putting Star-Lord and crew through, and giving an excellent introduction to the backgrounds and personal dilemmas of everyone. Honestly, if you had introduced this franchise to a complete newcomer, this game might outshine the MCU films in doing so. One particular mid-game scene was so emotional that I was honestly thinking about it a day or two later after I experienced it. It's really good. Guardians of the Galaxy is not the game I wanted Eidos Montreal to make. I need my conclusion to Adam Jensen's story yesterday. But that being said, against all odds, they showed everyone how to make a competent Marvel game this generation that doesn't require you to be employed at Insomniac. It's a damn shame that this didn't sell well. If I had to give up at the prospect of a return to the Deus Ex franchise, I wouldn't mind a follow-up story starring these Guardians. 7 years ago, I chose the original Life is Strange as my game of the year. I stand by that decision today in remembering how emotional, exciting, and tension-inducing this successor to the Telltale adventure game formula was. Anyone who would suggest that the original season wasn't inducing tears in them by the time the credits rolled is either someone who didn't actually play it at all, or is a heartless bastard that should really be put on some kind of government watch list. I found myself skipping Before the Storm and Life is Strange 2 for no particular reasons other than I just wasn't willing to wait for episodic releases and wanted to play the whole thing at once. By the time they'd fully released, I had other priorities to play, so I never really got around to them despite my intentions otherwise. I'll venture into Before the Storm soon with the remaster collection having recently come out, and then sometime thereafter discover what the numbered sequel season has to offer. All that being said, I experienced Life is Strange Season 3, True Colors, over the course of December and really enjoyed what I played of it. The story of Alex Chen and her adventure in the idyllic small town of Haven Springs, Colorado has a lot of heart to it. Though the story itself lacks the grand stakes of the original season. Though it does give off the significant feeling of being a more budget entry, the writing of True Colors makes up for it in spades. Alex's ability to empathically feel people's emotions and sometimes manipulate them towards a particular outcome makes for a tale that feels more subtle and restrained with a different scale of drama. As is the case with the rest of the series' entries, True Colors decisions do matter and have a significant impact that you bear witness to. And it's really good. It's kind of hard for me to really expound upon True Colors without going into spoilers, and I'd rather not do that in this particular case if I can help it. Suffice to say, I still think the original season did a better job, but for what's here and how it continues to flesh out this interconnected universe, it's very well done. Deck 9 is definitely on my watch list now, and as it appears that the industry is largely done with the episodic release formula, I expect to pick up the next game, which is based on the Expanse series, on day one. I lamented multiple times in the past that the curse of working with everyone on the podcast is that you get exposed to a considerable amount of footage and discussion about a game that you can't avoid. To me, it feels like I'm being spoiled for a game's content. That's just the way I think. I like to go into a game fresh, largely without any outside opinions or advice, so unless I play it at the same exact time as everyone else, chances are I'm not going to be touching it for a good while. Thus, Nier Automata's release in 2017 certainly spurred my interest in the franchise, but it was so heavily talked about back then in both impressions on the podcast and Game of the Year content that I wanted to wipe my mind of it before diving in. The other factor I had to consider, though, was that Automata was a sequel to a storied and well-loved game from a generation past, so logically, it would be prudent to play the OG before I played Automata, right? Well, considering that the original Nier wasn't getting a port anytime soon, and I had other things to play anyway, both games kind of ended up on my backlog in the someday category. And then Platinum announced that they were developing a remaster of sorts of the original Japanese version of Nier, entitled Replicant Square Root of 1.5. So yeah, why not play through this remake if it's reviewing well? So I did. And honestly, for the first playthrough to get onto the base ending, I wasn't particularly impressed. The combat is great and the music is pretty, don't get me wrong. But you can tell that this is a remaster of an 11-year-old game. The environments are vast but empty. Half the quests are fetch-oriented, and the enemy variety leaves a lot to be desired. If it weren't for the fact that beating Nier Replicant required earning multiple endings to get the whole story told, I'd probably not have this game anywhere near my top 10. But that's the thing. It does. Loading up a completionist save and loading into the B run is a transformative experience. Picking up from the halfway point, the narrative expands by providing your campaigning character Kairi with her own little demonic voice in her head, giving you additional background to her. But more importantly, subtitles are now provided that translate the mysterious language of the Shades, giving you depth to your enemies for the first time in nearly 20 or more hours of gameplay. All the cutscenes play out pretty much the exact same, but now that you can understand the Shades, you understand the full depth of the conflict and actually begin to feel terrible for fighting them. For the uninitiated, I won't spoil the scene that pushed me over the edge, but that moment, fighting Shades and now fully understanding that the game has locked me into combat for my protagonist's life, while revealing the motivations of the enemies, was an experience that I didn't have the proper adjectives or verbs for at the moment to describe it. Stunned, perhaps? I don't know. In that moment, I finally got it, just why Nier was so beloved by fans. To be clear, I've only earned the first 3 endings at this point. I need to dive back in to get the remaining 2 so I can complete the journey. But this isn't a someday backburner item anymore. This is a necessity. Nier Replicant is great, guys. Pick it up if you haven't and are even remotely interested in Platinum-style combat titles. I think you'll be a little surprised. The conclusion to the Forerunner trilogy has been a long, long time coming. 6.5 years have passed since we witnessed Cortana go rogue and seize the mantle of responsibility, using the Guardians to pacify organic life throughout the galaxy and bring an end to the continuing struggle between the remaining factions of the Covenant and humanity through cataclysmic means. That is what I wish I could say about what leads the setup and importance of the events of Halo Infinite, but it's not. Instead, this newest entry into the franchise is a soft reboot of sorts. A continuation of the story set up in Halo 4 and not offering a conclusion. It's weird. Really weird. But also very, very, very good. On its gameplay merits alone, Halo Infinite stands out as the best of the post-Bungie Halo trilogy, reworking the formula to function within a sprawling open world built upon the remains of a heavily damaged Halo ring. Main and side mission quest lines present scenarios that have that classic Halo flow to combat, which feels really good, while optional side objectives offer open engagement on your terms as you see fit. If anything, the greatest accomplishment on tap here is that 343 Industries successfully replicated the original Bungie formula for combat. Understanding that they were able to do so within an open world setting, riddled with optional and random encounters, speaks volumes to the quality of the campaign's gameplay experience. But then they went further by conquering the most tedious aspect of open world games, the traversal. Between the forward operating bases and randomly patrolling Banished, there's plenty of ways to obtain a vehicle to cross the huge map. The grapple shot they added to Chief's inventory, however, is an absolute game changer and simply feels incredible. I have to imagine that 343 developers took a good hard look at Doom Eternal's meat hook and said, yeah, we can do that too, and better. And they fucking did. The grapple shot is almost broken in its utility, from snatching up weapons out of enemies' hands, to bringing you in for a quick melee hit, to simply allowing you to climb almost any surface like you're some kind of flying mountain goat wielding an assault rifle. It's an amazing addition. I just wish the story was worth the nearly 10 years of build-up. It almost feels like 343 was too reactive to the negativity behind Halo 5, choosing to abandon many of the elements that set up in favor of doing a sort of side story. making Infinite into its own thing rather than a proper Halo 6. And that's what I had wanted out of this game. What we got, however, is an inconclusive, incomplete game with a great campaign experience that leaves me happy yet unsatisfied. Infinite, as the name implies, is designed to be a long-term platform rather than a singular game. It ends on a cliffhanger that hints at the next big threat to emerge, likely an expansion within the next 2 or so years. And I know I shouldn't complain about more Halo, but the Destiny-style release formula just doesn't do enough for me to be particularly happy. I love me some Halo. And though I have my reservations, Infinite is a return to form and evolution on the formula that the series is known for. Campaign-wise, 343 is to be commended for finally finding their stride and continuing the proud legacy Bungie left behind. They still have a lot of work to do on the other side of the coin, mainly the multiplayer experience. And I look forward to the day in which we can finally have series staples like camping co-op and Forge. Until then, Halo Infinite is in a good place and will only continue to get better over time. I just hope we don't have to wait another 5 years to get the conclusion to the story of the Master Chief. Capcom has been on a roll over the past several years with the Resident Evil franchise. Though I think we can all agree that it's probably about time for them to try producing new titles for older franchises that don't have Biohazard, Monster Hunter, or Street Fighter in their name. This new generation of Resident Evil that began with 7 a little over 5 years ago has been pretty stellar. The long-anticipated Resident Evil 2 remake was an exceptional example the industry is taking a long, hard look at, and the remake for Resident Evil 3, I will strongly argue, is better than it has been lamented to be. This trend continued with Resident Evil number 8, Village, and it will very much lives up to the potential 7 prophesized it to be. I really, really like it. And not just for the fact that Chris Redfield empties his entire magazine into Mia inside the first 5 minutes of the game. Village wants to be many things at once, but the two most prominent aspects are to serve as a direct continuation of Resident Evil 7 and serve as a spiritual imitator of Resident Evil 4. Now, I say imitator instead of successor because the gameplay formula of one of the greatest games of the 2000s is largely incompatible with this new generation's first-person survival horror formula. Balancing factor comes in the form of the traditional assortment of folklore beasts of European history. You know, vampires, werewolves, mermen, etc., which serve as the varied threats that encourage action gameplay throughout the vast majority of its playtime. And it works really, really well. Combat shares Resident Evil 7's claustrophobic, pressure-inducing nature with Resident Evil 4's Defend the House-style map structure. Village lives up to its namesake by using a wheel and spoke design, with the village at the heart of it that you can revisit to uncover secrets and unlock new items in between major quest events. And despite some logical inconsistencies, the village itself does feel very lived in. You can easily find yourself spending at least an hour each time you come back from a quest, exploring to find new things to unlock, finding out what has changed over time as progressed, and what new threats are lurking in the shadows just waiting to pounce. Another great thing for this new run of Resident Evil games has been a seemingly renewed emphasis on replayability. It is this singular consideration that bumped Village up to my number 2 spot this year, as while the overall game experience is fun, the ability to unlock modifiers and extra content for subsequent playthroughs on higher difficulty levels made me come back for hardcore and even Village of Shadows playthroughs. Sure, you could argue that using that unlocked content is a cop-out to the true experience of the difficulty mode, but I say fuck that. I put the work in, I earned this shit, don't shame me for using it. Replaying Village, discovering all the changes that the game throws at you, and hoping to survive further aggroed enemies honestly felt great. If you came into the game meaning to play it for just a single playthrough, I personally think you're doing yourself a disservice. Resident Evil 8 Village overall is a great video game. Though I find myself increasingly wondering at what point we're going to reach complete global saturation for this franchise, I don't think I find myself saying no to playing the next mainline entry on day one when it releases. Over the past decade, I have fallen absolutely in love with the Hitman franchise. The 2016 soft reboot served as an excellent course correction from Absolution's misguided design and structure, while 2018's Hitman 2, though brief, grew on that reinvigorated design, providing even more intricately built maps and opportunities for replayability. The culmination of this trilogy with Hitman 3 is, in my opinion, also IO Interactive's best work to date. I fucking love this game. After Hitman 2's exciting cliffhanger ending and very fun DLC missions, I was obviously prepared to enjoy Hitman 3, but I didn't expect to fall in love with it as much as I have. It's hard not to repeat everything I've said in my 2016 and 2018 Game of the Year videos about Hitman 1 and 2, because they do share the same design and functionality as this entry. Hitman 3 is very much an iterative improvement rather than an evolutionary one over its predecessors. That is, in most respects. For me, the third level in this game, entitled Apex Predator, serves as two of the most magical hours of gaming I experienced in all of 2021. This singular level absolutely awed me in what it was trying to accomplish, and in my personal opinion, is the best Hitman level IO has ever created. Set in a German decommissioned power plant converted into a nightclub, you are being hunted. Enemy agents from the ICA have tracked down an associate of Agent 47 to this club, and it is your goal to clear them out and rescue the contact. When you begin the mission, there is no briefing, no information presented to the player. You fade in at a gas station on the side of a dark road in the middle of the night. Everything that happens from the start to finish is completely organic, as you know of threats on the map, but you don't know who or where they are. You have to actively explore and discover who is hunting you, and then take out a number of them in the traditional Hitman style. And it is fucking brilliant. Playing through Apex Predator and discovering all the avenues and options available to you feels amazing, even on your third or fourth time through. The modern Hitman trilogy's structuring of replayability through varied assassination methods and challenges already did a great job of encouraging you to try the many ways of taking out your targets. But it almost feels like Apex Predator, and by extension Hitman 3 as a whole, is the model for IO Interactive's experimentation and adaptation of their gameplay models for new games in the future beyond this particular franchise. The glory of discovery, learning of the threats you are to face instead of being briefed, and figuring out how to neutralize them feels transcendent over the base Hitman formula. I would even argue that those among us who are excited for their upcoming James Bond title should play through Apex Predator to get a snapshot of what we can expect once that game comes around, as this particular level feels foundational and incredibly sound to base an entire game around. Let me reiterate that I think Hitman 3 is the best work IO Interactive has ever done. Though Apex Predator is my favorite gameplay experience of the year, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Chongqing, or Argentina, or the Dartmoor Manor, or even the new sniper map set in a Siberian prison. Apex Predator is easily my favorite, but the incredible work IO Interactive has put into this game is largely shared across its entirety. When the only thing you can really lament about a game is its brevity, you know that you have something great on your hands. I love Hitman 3. So much so that I name it as my absolute favorite game of 2021. Alright guys, that's it. That's my list. Thank you very much for watching. So I am very sorry that it took so long for this to come out, even longer than everyone else's videos. I just had stuff going on. And we are already in discussions to actually start doing this Game of the Year content before the end of the year. So hopefully we'll get those out before January, actually. That's the hope. Anyway, y'all have a pleasant one, and hope you keep coming around. Thanks for watching.